involved in conspiracy theories. You know, there are lots of them. They can go on. We can speculate on that forever. What we really need to know is how those buildings came down.
My husband Steve was 48 years old when he was killed on September 11th, 2001. He was in the North Tower on the 104th floor. There are so many unanswered questions, and that's scary to me. We never had answers. Nobody ever stopped to have a scientific investigation. A scientific investigation. A scientific investigation.
Tribute lights in the New York skyline. An annual memorial to the lives lost on 9/11. Yet there's still more light that needs to shine, revealing truths that their family members deserve to know. September 11th, 2001, a day that changed history. 4 planes went silent and off course. 2 of those planes crashed into the World Trade Center Twin Towers. Several columns were severed, and the jet fuel ignited fires that spread over several floors. About an hour later, millions watched in shock as both towers were suddenly and rapidly destroyed, killing almost 3,000 people, for whom truth and justice may have yet to be served. Hi, I'm Richard Gage, AIA, licensed architect of over 20 years and member of the American Institute of Architects. I'm founder of Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, a nonprofit organization of well over 1,000 technical and building professionals. According to official government reports, the fires weakened the structural steel framing of both twin towers, leading to sudden, progressive, and total collapses. Unknown to most people, a third steel frame high-rise, World Trade Center 7, was also destroyed. Critical questions have been raised by more than 1,500 architects and engineers about the official explanations for the destruction of all 3 of these buildings. Along with more than 10,000 other concerned individuals, these professionals, collectively comprising more than 25,000 years of experience, have signed our petition. They're calling for a new investigation into the destruction of these 3 World Trade Center high-rises. This call is based on evidence that reveals a very different destruction scenario than reported by government engineers. This includes abundant scientific forensic data and eyewitness testimony that was omitted from the official reports. You'll be seeing this evidence and hearing from dozens of these technical experts, including many who are among the top in their respective fields.
I claim they're not doing science at all. They're doing propaganda or publicity or whatever they're doing, but it's not science. It's not playing by the rules of science.
We at AE 9/11 Truth take President Obama at his word in his affirmation to the American people during his inauguration. How do we accomplish this? We've done our best by using the scientific method, examining the evidence from the World Trade Center and developing unbiased conclusions from unbiased experts in their fields. As coherent sets of scientific facts are brought into focus by the experts, the data, and the witnesses in this film, you'll come to a much greater understanding of the events of 9/11 and will be in a position to draw your own informed conclusions. Of course, the ones still most affected by the events of that tragic day are the family members of the victims lost on 9/11. Several have asked to appear in this documentary. Although our focus will be primarily technical, we are deeply moved and honored to give them the opportunity to speak directly to you. Now, let's hear from the AE 9/11 Truth professional petition signers who will share with you what conclusions they came to. Among these experts are high-rise architects and engineers in the fields of structural design, materials science, chemistry, fire protection, metallurgy, as well as physicists, explosives experts, and demolition technicians. The new World Trade Center Building 7 looms above the site of its original. Building 7 was a 47-story high-rise, not hit by an airplane. Yet it was the third modern steel-frame skyscraper to collapse rapidly and symmetrically on 9/11. It was a football field away from the North Tower and sustained minor damage from falling debris. Building 7's precipitous collapse was blamed on normal office fires.
I'm Steve Parrish, founder and president of Parrish Architects and Associates, Inc., a 33-year-old architecture planning and engineering firm. One of the things that really interested me is how quickly the Tower 7 fell. It fell within 7 seconds approximately from top to bottom. This building was built in the mid-'80s and met all the codes at the time.
From about 1965 until about 1985, most of my experience has been in high-rise, multi-story steel buildings. NIST would have us to believe that these was a typical office fire, scattered office fires, if you will, that brought this building down. Since the mid-'60s, I've tried to follow high-rise fires because they're something we worry a lot about as we design these buildings. And I'm not aware of any high-rise building that have come down as a result of fires.
I first became aware of the problems with the official account of the collapse when I saw a DVD online from Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth. They pointed out various problems with the official story, and the ones that caught my attention were the rapid failure of the connections in order for the building to come down at the rate that it did.
I've been involved in many large projects, including overseeing several high-rise buildings ranging in size from 14 stories to 40. Over the course of 20 years, I'm mainly called in to help with very large, difficult projects. When I watched Building 7 collapse, it basically left no doubt in my mind that something was wrong. Building 7 had not been hit by a plane.
The coup de grace for me was when I found out that Building 7 had collapsed later that day, and when I saw Building 7 come down. To me, the fact that it looks like a perfect controlled demolition of an intact building I mean, that's what I call a smoking gun.
Was the structural steel from World Trade Center 7 preserved, documented, analyzed according to standard procedures for investigating engineering failures?
Hailing the collapse study as an assessment rather than as an investigation has allowed valuable evidence in the form of the tower's structural steel to be destroyed. It is a steel that holds the primary key to understanding the chronology of the events resulting in the collapse.
When did you become aware that the steel from the World Trade Center was being sold off?
I think it was on the order of a week or so before we arrived on site on October the 5th, I believe it was.
So they were, in other words, the city was selling or was disposing of material within 2 weeks of the actual event?
I believe I was the first one to find out that the steel is being recycled. New York Times reporter Jim Glantz told me 2 weeks after the collapse, and I tried to contact city, and also New York Times reporters tried to make sure we can have access to steel to do the research. It was not happening.
I just think there's so much that has been lost in these last 6 months that we can never go back and retrieve. And it's not only unfortunate, it's borderline criminal.
400 truckloads per day of material were taken away from the World Trade Center site and sent to China for recycling.
There were laws violated in the destruction of that evidence. And for the American Society of Civil Engineers to ignore those events is extremely disturbing and is a violation, in my opinion, of their professional code of ethics.
It was contrary to the way all investigations are done. If an airplane crashes, they seal off the entire area, nobody touches anything, they move it to a secure location, and they reconstruct an aircraft.
Normally, when you have a structural failure, you carefully go through the debris field, looking at each item, photographing every beam as it collapsed and every column where it is in the ground, and you pick them up very carefully and you look at each element. We were unable to do that in the case of Tower 7.
You can't do science when you are deprived of the evidence and when your hypothesis is the least valid instead of the most likely. When the most likely hypothesis in the case of Building 7 wasn't even mentioned. This is not science. It's trying to prove preconceived ideas.
Was a proper investigation performed that might have revealed the use of accelerants or explosives in World Trade Center 7's destruction?
NIST concedes that they found no evidence for explosives. So then we asked them, well, did you look? And they said, no, we did not look for explosives or residues of explosives.
The American Society of Civil Engineers was brought into this investigation early on. They did a very superficial investigation of the site. They issued a report without any significant forensic examination.
National Fire Protection Association Guide number 921 calls for saving the evidence and being prepared to justify why you wouldn't. It also calls for testing for accelerants and explosives when high-order damage is involved. NIST did not do this.
The minimum explosive charge, the 9 pounds, required to fail critical column IE-79 would have produced a pressure wave that would have broken windows in the north and east, resulted in a sound level of 130 to 140 decibels, which is the equivalent sound to a gunshot blast. There were no witness reports of such a loud noise.
There were all kinds of firefighters and civilians that were reporting explosions.
You heard explosions, like boom. It's like a distinct sound. It's not like when in compression, like boom, 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 like floors that were dropping and collapsing. This was boom, and like you felt a rumble in the ground, like almost like you wanted to grab onto something.
Big explosion. Blew us back into the 8th floor. I'm okay, all right? Here, hold on. You want to call your mother or something?
Just the fact that there were explosions means they need to be investigated. Terrorists used explosives in '93. We had witnesses to explosions. We have audio recording of explosions. We have overwhelming evidence that there were some explosive events. The manual gets into thermite, and if it says if you have melted steel or concrete, which we had on 9/11, and there's videos of it, and people can see it, we should test for it. It says when you have melted steel or concrete, you test for thermite. So the fact that they're not testing for it is crazy.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down. The building is about to blow up. Moving back. We are looking back. There's a building about to blow up.
We had 3,000, Americans murdered, and we had the first 3 high-rise and steel collapses. We have all these reports of explosions. We have the history of terrorists using explosives. It's absolutely ridiculous that there's no excuse for it. It's criminal, in my opinion. The national standards are very clear. We have preservation of evidence. We have spoliation of evidence. There's all kinds of basically standards that you don't destroy evidence. We don't have the real story on what happened because there wasn't a proper investigation done.
World Trade Center 7 collapsed because of fires fueled by office furnishings. It did not collapse from explosives or from fuel oil fires.
As reported by the New York Times, engineers were baffled by the collapse of Building 7. Since no steel frame high-rise has ever completely collapsed due to fire, how are we to understand this mysterious event?
High-rise buildings simply do not collapse due to fire. There has never been until 9/11 an experience where a high-rise building that was steel frame completely collapsed. There have been fires burned longer in similar structures without any collapse.
In this test, done by British Steel in 1995, a large amount of typical office furniture was burned to see what would happen to the heavy steel beams that supported the ceiling.
It's not that it melts in a fire. In fact, normal fires are not hot enough to melt steel. Even if you were, for example, to use an unusual fuel like kerosene, you cannot achieve temperatures hot enough to melt steel. But what happens is it starts to lose its strength. And as it loses its strength, it starts to sag.
This was the largest test of its kind ever conducted. It showed how unprotected steel can be distorted, even by a normal office fire. But as is typical in steel buildings, the structural beams only slowly and progressively warped and sagged. There was no chance of a sudden collapse.
In my previous career as a firefighter, normally you'd never be afraid to go into a Type 1 building because they're not combustible, and you would just charge at it and put the fire out. Never in my training were we ever taught that these type of buildings could just collapse in on themselves. There's definitely much more going on than just fire.
The World Trade Center 7 building reminds me of the Meridian Bank building in some ways in Philadelphia. The Meridian Bank building is a 38-story skyscraper that burned for 18 hours in 1991, suffered extensive damage from the fire, but did not collapse.
NIST tells us that this collapse mechanism, starting with thermal expansion, that worked its way upward and outward through the building, in a matter of seconds, there's not enough time for the building to collapse the way that NIST tells us it collapsed.
NIST claims the fires were very large, very hot, and long-lasting, when in reality, observation, which has been researched by many people, shows these fires did not last very long. They were not in the locations where NIST claims they were at given times.
I'm a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. For the 40-plus years that I've been practicing architecture, I've designed a variety of buildings from small houses to high-rise office buildings. Some of the high-rises that I've worked on are 1-shell and 2-shell here in Houston. I was project manager for a 22-story office building in Akron, Ohio. Later in the day, when World Trade Center 7 collapsed, they had already showed us pictures of a few fires in that building, and I mean, they weren't even raging. And how could that cause a building to collapse as if it were imploded? Couldn't happen.
According to lead investigator Shyam Sunder of the National Institute for Standards and Technology, NIST, World Trade Center 7 collapsed at free-fall acceleration for more than 100 feet of its fall. What does the speed of the collapse reveal to us?
Essentially, in less than 7 seconds, Tower 7 came down upon itself.
It's just like taking your car keys out and just dropping them. That's how fast the building came down, for over 100 feet. And the only way you can get that is when there's zero resistance. And so what we're looking at is a building just coming straight down, falling right through itself with zero resistance. Buildings don't have zero resistance, which is why you feel comfortable walking into a building.
This building had 40,000 tons of structural steel in its structural system, and that is intended to keep it from going anywhere.
I'd heard people say, well, it came down at free fall or close to free fall and so forth, so I decided I'd measure it myself. I had a simple tool at the time called a physics toolkit, which allowed me to take a video and put a dot on each frame to follow the motion of things. And I realized that it's actually coming down at free fall, pretty much dead on the acceleration of gravity. Well, NIST, in their final draft, was saying that the building came down with 40% longer than free fall time.
How can such a publicly visible, easily measurable quantity be set aside?
A free fall time would be an object that has no structural components below it. There was structural resistance that was provided in this particular case.
He was making our case for us. You can't have free fall when there's support. And in the final report, they modified it and they actually admitted there was a period of free fall involved. But they never changed their model. Like, how do you all of a sudden allow for free fall when they just got done explaining how it couldn't have been in free fall?
NIST is telling us that the building below it ceased to exist for the first few seconds of the collapse of the building. Well, things in physics just don't cease to exist and cease to resist the forces that are on them. The building didn't disappear so the building can fall for 100 feet at free fall speed. That's impossible. That's a violation of the fundamental law of physics that says that for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction.
If floors fall, they tend to fall and are braced by the floor directly beneath it, and there's some delay there.
Because of redundancy, because of all the other columns in the building that were not affected.
Even if a floor were to collapse, it still wouldn't be able to collapse all of the connections simultaneously at the rate that it did without secondary explosions.
We might anticipate that an unevenly damaged building would fall over. Yet, videos of the collapse of Building 7 show a fairly symmetrical fall. How do we make sense of this?
If the buildings had come down by fire, we would have seen a more natural progression of collapse.
And clearly a more asymmetrical pattern should have been present.
The symmetry is the smoking gun. It cannot happen that when you have asymmetric damage, you will get a perfectly symmetrical collapse.
The exterior columns on the outside as well as on the inside at the bottom would have to be severed almost at the same time.
I worked for Controlled Demolition Incorporated, CDI, the top-rated explosives demolition firm in the world. As an explosives loader, my job was to place explosives in the buildings to prepare them for demolition. I was licensed while in New York by the New York Fire Department to handle explosives. And I worked on major projects such as Seattle Kingdom, the Three River Stadium, Philadelphia Naval Hospital, and Key Span gas holders in New York. What I saw, it was a classic implosion. The center of the core, the penthouse area, starts to move first, and then the building follows along with it. That's another indicator that this NIST report is very suspect.
When it's all finished, the outside walls are piled one on top of the other right in the middle of the building. Just like a house of cards if it were coming down.
As a structural engineer, I don't believe that the failure of one column would normally bring down an entire building in the way we saw World Trade Center 7 come down.
According to NIST, the failure occurred at column 79 on level 12. This means basically they're talking about a single columnar collapse or failure that resulted in a total collapse of the building. That just does not make any sense.
NIST provided computer animations in support of their fire collapse theory. But what do independent engineers say about these animations?
When you observe the footage of how the building failed and when you look at the animation of the failure and compare that to what you actually observe in reality, I think they disprove their own theories.
The exterior of the NIST World Trade Center 7 computer simulation model, which they put together to try to explain their theory, shows large, very large deformations which are not observed in the video of the actual event. Yet they don't attempt to explain this in the report. What we see on the real video is not a natural collapse.
had to be some agent that was destroying the connections in building number 7 at 400 connections per second. And the only thing that I can see that would be capable of doing this would be explosive devices at the connections. And this is why I think that there has to be a new investigation to find out the real physical causes for all these members to act in an atypical fashion.
The Freedom of Information Act request to NIST by a registered structural engineer for calculations and analysis was denied by NIST, with the claim that releasing this data might jeopardize public safety. How could it possibly jeopardize public safety to tell people in the industry, engineers who were responsible for designing these buildings, how this failure could occur?
Science is never secret when it's done right. Science is a way of finding out that is self-correcting and involves many people. Science isn't science unless it's published, unless it's openly published and made available for criticism.
The explanations from FEMA and from NIST don't add up. But there is enormous circumstantial evidence, circumstantial and actually physical evidence as well, that would lead us to a different conclusion. And the conclusion is controlled demolition.
Dit is controlled demolition. Zeker weten. Zeker weten. Er is nagesprongen. Dit is in opdracht gebeurd. Dit heeft een team gedaan van experts.
Building 7 to me is really what gives it away, because that's a classic case of controlled demolition.
Architects and engineers, people all around the world, scientists all around the world are questioning this. When you bring science into the equation, that's so important because you can't argue against science. And there's some deep, deep explaining to do.
The bottom line is that it needs to be investigated properly.
We will never heal. This country will never, ever, ever forget that day. We have to demand a new investigation. I want justice here.
The forensic evidence that you've seen is very real. New light has been shown. A third beam now reaches into the pitch black sky and stands in for the still officially unexplained free-fall destruction of the World Trade Center Building 7. The obvious dark truth about Building 7 may very well provide the key to justice for the victims of family members of the destruction of the Twin Towers.